This is a talk I will be presenting at the Ralph Winter Memorial Lectureship on the homogeneous unit principle in early March of 2022. I will share insights I've gained about movements, people groups, and melting pots from my personal life and from history and the Bible. I have lived on 5 different continents for 5 to 15 years at a time: Central America, North Africa, the UK, India, and North America. Each context yielded different insights. I grew up in Guatemala. In each region, Latinos spoke Spanish, the trade language, and the Mayan tribal peoples each had their own different languages, diets, and proudly wore distinctive handmade outfits. So there was sort of a Latino colonial veneer with regional Mayan tribal peoples. The need for separate Bibles and movements in each tribe based on language and culture became obvious. In these pictures, you can see on the left, the women from Atitlan with yards of ribbons round around their head, making sort of a brimmed hat. And in the middle, the Cachiquel women with the shawl hats and navy skirts with embroidered belts. And then on the right-hand side, you can see Quiche women holding their Quiche Bible with their elaborately tie-dyed skirts. This tie-dyed methodology they were very proud of, and it was a highly guarded secret. So you could easily tell which tribe a person came from, male or female, by their tribal outfits. Insights from Guatemala. So before my parents even arrived in Guatemala, Cameron Townsend was there a generation earlier, and in 1917, he was asked this question by a Mayan tribal person: why can't God speak my language? Up until that time, the Roman Catholic churches, which had been there for centuries, were in the Latin language. And the Protestant churches, which arrived in the 19th century, were all in Spanish. Cameron Townsend was very shocked by this question. And he realized that these Indian languages also mattered to God and this might be why there weren't movements going in the Indian tribal areas. Dudley and Dorothy Peck ended up in the Mon Indian tribal area, which is where my parents eventually came. And you can see them in this picture wearing the traditional Mon Indian clothing, Dudley and Dorothy, and then their daughter. So both Dorothy and her daughter are dressed with the dark blue skirts, red blouses, and wide black and white bands that were typical of the Mon tribe. They actually translated the Bible into the Mon language. And so the full Mon Bible was available by the time my parents reached there. My father, Ralph Winter, when he arrived, realized that the Indian pastors were being trained in Spanish in the seminary that was down on the coast, and that they only started Spanish churches. As a result, he started theological education by extension about 1960, so that the Indian pastors could be trained in their Indian tribal areas without having to go to the Spanish seminary. The insight that came out of this is that without people group eyes, the ones that are left out are often the minority people groups, the least respected peoples. When Cameron Townsend started Wycliffe to make sure that his insight about languages went global, it led to a huge explosion in movements among minority people groups all around the world, people groups that hadn't been affected by Christian missions before. We lived 8 years in North Africa and had a team of 40 adults working with 3 of the largest Berber tribal people groups. There are 13 different large tribes in North Africa, each with their own Berber language and their own spices and their own rug designs. But Arabs have ruled there for the last 1,300 years. It was people group thinking that revealed the plight of the Berbers to my husband and myself when we decided to go to Morocco, and that they had been overlooked by Bible societies. So insights from North Africa include the fact that the early Berber Christians, which left no Berber Bibles even after 5 centuries of contact, and no sustained indigenous movements to Christ, were left in the Berber people groups, unlike Armenia, which had its own Bible. The Berber Christianity was erased when the Arab invaders, who banned the alphabet of the Berber tribal peoples, came. A recent movement among the Kabyle Berbers has also suffered severely, and they do not have a complete Bible in their own language yet. Only in the last few years have Berber language Bibles even begun to appear. The Rifi Berber tribal area where we lived for 8 years finally has their full Rifi Berber Bible just a few years ago. There are no scriptures in the Moroccan Arabic language either, because Moroccan Arabic is not considered high class enough Arabic to be a written language. As a result, there are no movements even among the Moroccan Arabs. I believe it is because they don't have any Bible they can read in the language they actually speak. So the insight from there is that heart language worship and scriptures are key to developing self-sustained indigenous movements. But decades of failure even led to more insights than that. When we arrived in Morocco in 1981, there was only one church left after 100 years of Protestant outreach. There were elders for the entire country, and we moved to the city of Fez, and within months we were able to gather up a contextualized church in our living room, sitting on Moroccan couches, complete with offerings for the poor. The Arabs would sit on one side of the room, the Berbers would sit on the other side of the room, but we noticed that they didn't gather if we weren't there. 100 years of outreach to Moroccan Arabs had left less believers in the country than the number of missionaries that had gone before. So without movements to Christ, churches slowly die out, and no people group becomes reached without a self-sustaining indigenous movement which incorporates whole families. The second insight came when we tried to get together a Rifi Berber church. So this time we weren't trying to put Arabs and Berbers into the same group. We weren't even trying to put people from different Berber areas into the same group, because they would end up arguing about which Berber language was the correct one. No, we got two people from the Rifi Berber tribe, Ali from Al Hoceima and Omar from Nador, into the same room. We thought they would fall on each other's shoulders with big hugs to find another Rifi Berber who was a believer. But instead, they barely talked to each other, barely looked at each other. And then we realized that there was longstanding distrust, not only between the Berber tribes and the Arabs, but because of the totalitarian state and secret police, it had further eroded trust between people groups and even between clans in the same Berber people group. And without trust relationships, it turns out, movements do not form. Aggregate churches don't start movements and hurt families. By an aggregate church, I mean churches where you put people together and you try to make them into a church, people that didn't know each other before. There's no trust relationship between them. So even though those believers might begin to trust each other and love each other, their families are often left out. They're pulled out of their families, and their families don't necessarily come to faith because they don't trust the other people that are in that new group. The third insight we had is that the strongest believers were those whose mothers had come to faith and had raised them as believers. This is the situation in Morocco. And that without women coming to faith, you lose the next generation. I actually wrote a whole article about this called Underground Church Planting Movements, the Surprising Role of Women's Networks, in about 2008, where I talk about Korea and China and how the Bible women became the basis of the movements there. They would train other women in the Bible in their towns and villages and go from village to village training women. And as a result, the sons of those women became the leaders of the movements to Christ in Korea and in China. We came back to the United States for a while when my parents were dying of cancer, but after my parents died, we moved to India. The question is why? Well, my husband was the international director of Frontiers, which works with Muslim people, but India was the country with the longest mission history and the least progress of the gospel, and it was the second largest Muslim country in the world. It was sort of known as the graveyard of missionaries. Donald McGavran, who was a third generation Indian expat, noticed that self-sustaining indigenous movements in India tended to run within people groups and only cross into other people groups through bicultural bridge people. These are his famous insights that led to the homogeneous unit principle. But India is sort of the quintessential multicultural non-melting pot. I picked the picture on the left with the marbles, which to show the multiple layers of high identity that exist in India. For example, in the left-hand jar, if you think of the left-hand jar as Sunni Muslim people, there's a lot of people groups inside the jar. The big black marble could, for example, represent the Kashmiri Sunni Muslims, which actually live in a geographical area in the country, which would tend to make them easier to reach. But the other colors can represent other Sunni Muslim groups that are scattered out all over different parts of India that have a dual high identity. One high identity is the people group that they are part of, and the second high identity is that they are Sunni Muslims. So India is a very complex situation of high identity people groups with multiple identities. After 3 generations living in India, McGavin was still an expat. And I have 3 grandchildren that were born in India. But I remember my son had to sign a document saying that they were never going to try to get Indian citizenship. This is exactly the opposite of melting pot countries like the United States, where we give citizenship to anybody born here. And we appreciate the inflow of many different people from many different places. So we notice that the Indian people groups have multiple layers of exclusive identities. People groups with high identity are not necessarily homogeneous, either linguistically or generationally, but that doesn't mean that movements don't follow along these people group lines. So India is basically 3,000 years of resistance to being a melting pot. In India, most people groups are not localized either. For example, in Calcutta, where our son was living, there was a Tamil Muslim family in their building. The Tamil Muslim family did not speak Urdu or any of the North Indian languages. They only spoke Tamil, which is from South India, and English. There's also an interesting movie called Meet the Patels, which talks about Patels who have moved to other countries and how they get married and how they meet each other. And they have this big, giant telephone book size book of Patels all over the world, so you can figure out who to marry. In India itself, people's clothes can show what religion they're from or what region they're from or what people group they're from. I had to learn which clothes to wear in order to identify with the Shia Muslim community that I was wanting to be a part of. I did not realize this at first. And I just bought the clothing that I liked in the markets of Delhi. And then I found out later, oh, these clothing identifies me as being from Lucknow or from Jaipur or from Kashmir. And they shouted tourists because people in Delhi didn't wear those kind of clothes. And I couldn't just buy the clothes that I thought were the most beautiful. You'd think I would have learned this from Guatemala. Also, the churches that were in Delhi were multi-ethnic churches, but they were not multicultural. In other words, people came from all over India to Delhi and joined these churches, but the churches were fully English, Western, modern Christian culture. They would sing Hillsong songs, they would sit on plastic chairs. In no way did they represent the culture of the different people groups that were in the church. It was a melting pot situation, and so the Christianity that was there was what they had in common, which turned out to be English, Western, modern Christian culture. So today, half of the largest frontier people groups in the world are in India, both by number and by population. A frontier people group is a people group that has less than 0.1% Christians and no known movements among them. There are 272 frontier people groups that are over 1 million in size, and 135 of them are in India. The 272 have a population together of 1.6 billion. There's 2 billion people in all the frontier people groups. 8.85 billion of them are in India. India's frontier people groups are virtually untouched by the churches of India, which are these Western style churches. There's 600 million people in other backward castes, the Shudra caste of peoples in India that are not touched by the gospel. There's also 200 million Muslims that are in Sunni groups, Shia groups, Sufi groups, other sects, Deobandi, Barelvi. And then there's this really amazing global group called the Tablighi Jamaat, which is started less than 100 years ago and now has some 50 million adherents globally. Started in India. Then there are Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, tribals, different castes. A town of 100,000 could have dozens of distinct unreached people groups in that same town. The people groups are spread out all over. Most of the people groups in India have been reached, which have been reached, are either geographically concentrated or they're very small ethnic religion groups, they're tribal background groups. Because the caste system is occupation or trade-based, the other people groups, the caste people groups, are spread out all over in all the towns. And they may not even consistently speak the same language as others in their own group. A Sunni Tamil Muslim family in Calcutta, like I talked about, it relates more to all the other Sunni Tamil people groups all over the world than they do to the people that actually live in Calcutta. We also had a Shia friend who was living in a Sunni neighborhood and pretended to be Sunni most of the time because they were afraid of what the people in their Sunni Muslim neighborhood would do to them if they found out that they were Shia believers. So do we extract these people from their households and try to put them into a westernized Hillsong singing church like the other people groups that get together in Delhi? So there are various forms of people group thinking around the world. People group focus can seem to support adversarial or hierarchical views of people group identity, which emphasize animosity or revenge instead of biblical views of common humanity and breaking down walls of hostility. One example is the Indian caste system, where for centuries, people groups have been designated by these hierarchies. And a lot of the Indian people are not even in the caste system, they're outcasts. But then we also have critical race theory, which tries to right some of these wrongs. It tries to help the people that have been condemned historically by putting them in, giving them honor. It champions justice for the oppressed, but without reconciliation, ironically, reinstituting a kind of racial segregation in the process. Then there's Darwin's theory, which legitimized white supremacy and eugenics as it hit the world in the late 1900s. It legitimized the false idea that we are not one human race, but we are different races, some of us more evolved than others. White supremacy and eugenics, which is the need to breed a better human, spread as Darwinism spread around the world. And some organizations like Planned Parenthood were founded on the basis of eugenics and white supremacy, creating ethnocentrism along with racial theories of inequality. There are also insights from America. America has been the country that has most respected a melting pot idea of humanity. Because of their history as immigrants, Americans tend to put a high value on multiculturalism, and they sort of idealize melting pot society as the ultimate sign of mutual respect. As a third culture kid that grew up speaking Spanish and English, then learned to speak various amounts of Arabic, Berber, Hindi, and Urdu, I have learned to love the differences in language and culture, foods and festivals, taboos and talents. I love eating and dressing like the local culture. Was that cultural appreciation or was that cultural appropriation? Who knows? There's a huge tension in America between wanting to erase people group identities and distinctions and the need for some form of people group identity that seems a natural desire to mankind. So people begin to question the idea, is melting pot the best way to honor people from different backgrounds or not? The characteristics of multicultural or melting pot civilizations can include things like a loss of identity with the culture of origin, often a loss of your language in a generation or two. Your new identity with the dominant culture of the melting pot can erase your old identity, and your old identity becomes either subsumed or you become like a third culture person. There's also intolerance of opposing ideas in melting pot civilizations. The best ancient example of a melting pot was in Rome, when you had to, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, as they said. You weren't supposed to bring in your other ways, you were supposed to become like the Romans. Ethnically diverse situations can become monocultural. Like in America, Rome gave Roman citizenship to people from hundreds of different ethnic backgrounds. Even former slaves could eventually become Roman citizens. Those who became Roman citizens, however, were expected to adopt the Roman language and culture and to support the cultural and political imperialism of Rome. The Roman Catholic Church adopted this Roman idea using the Roman language and forms. The Roman Catholic leadership largely had an anti-homogeneous unit principle approach to the gospel. So, is there something better than melting pots and salad bowls? Mohammed Berry writes, food metaphors like the melting pot and the salad bowl theories have illustrated different approaches to integration by explaining the political and power dynamics between dominant and minority groups. By combining ethnic identities into homogeneous and or multicultural outcomes, food metaphors empower dominant ethnic groups. For refugees, this obscures their actual socio-political circumstances and erases their historical experiences. So the difference between sort of the melting pot and the salad bowl theory of civilizations is having people group eyes. People group eyes consider all peoples of equal value. So I watched for Guatemalan tribal group peoples streaming across the border. 2 million people have come across the southern border of America in the last year. But every picture I saw, people were dressed like Latinos or dressed to fit into an American melting pot. So they seemed to me, it was sort of sad to me, having grown up in an Indian tribe in Guatemala, to see that they were not only giving up their land, but they were giving up their tribal language, they were giving up their tribal culture, they were giving up their tribal ways of dressing and their heritage as native Mayan tribal peoples. And it is rare, I think, that an immigrant would not have preferred to thrive in their own homeland rather than have to give all that up to come to the land of promise, which is the United States. Everybody's supposed to get richer if they come here. And it makes me sad. I think too often people that come to the United States are unaware of what they're getting into in terms of what it's going to do to their language and culture and the heritage of their families. So the question is the goal of the gospel a melting pot, a salad, breaking down people groups, or is the goal of the gospel ending hostilities? In Ephesians 2:3-18, it says, but now in Jesus Christ, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near, for through him we have equal access in one spirit to the Father. You could think from this verse that the goal is possibly a melting pot, one new man, made up after the hostilities have been broken down. But is that what we see Jesus doing and God doing in history? There are some insights from scripture that Jesus is our peace. Harmony is not hostility, unity without uniformity. So the point is the breaking down the walls of hostility, becoming brothers and sisters in Christ, which does not require breaking down ethno-familial identities. Abraham's descendants, for example, spent 400 years in Egypt, but God still organized them by family lines and by tribes when they came out of Egypt 400 years later, and when he settled them into the promised land. In Revelation, people from every tribe, tongue, and ethne are in God's kingdom. In Genesis 10 through 12, we see him enumerating all the families of the earth that he's going to bless. And Jesus let the Samaritans be Samaritans, worshiping in spirit and truth. The Jewish people refused to melt into the Roman pot, but then the Judaizers thought believing Gentiles should somehow become like them, undermining the gospel. Instead, Paul told the Galatians, being circumcised or not is not important. What counts is a new creation, faith expressing itself in love. So we see distinct biblical movements in the Bible. There's the Way, what was called the Way, which was Jewish movements. There was the Samaritan movements to Christ. Here's a picture of the Samaritans today. Then there were Christians in the city of Antioch, which was sort of a melting pot city of Gentiles. So insights from global history would be that movements among Gentiles followed people group lines, including melting pot peoples. Antioch was a Roman melting pot city. Paul was bicultural, like many first or second generation melting pot people. But there were also urban movements in melting pot cities that took the characteristics of that context. But not all cities were or are melting pots. Los Angeles has Korean, Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese, Armenian, etc. churches. The grandchildren may attend the melting pot churches, but the first and second generation people haven't melted into the pot yet exactly, and they are free to have their own churches. Today's multi-ethnic global nomads represent a westernized, globalized people group, which will have movements like themselves also. But that doesn't mean that we should have as a goal that everybody become a westernized, globalized person. So there are many other people groups in history that have spread along people group lines, many other movements to Christ, and have resisted the Roman multi-ethnic melting pot idea. Here's an example of an Armenian Orthodox church. So some examples of this are the Martoma people in India, Armenians, Ethiopians, the Celtic and Irish people, which managed to have their own movement to Christ that lasted 200 years before they were forced back into the Latin melting pot. The Nestorians split off the Persian believers. There was a split off of the Greek Orthodox churches over the use of the Latin versus the Greek language. There was the split off of of the Germanic and Northern Europeans during the Protestant Reformation. The history of Protestant mission movements has gone by language and people group. The more Christian leaders tried to force people into the same language or structure or Christian culture, the greater animosity there became between different branches of Christianity. And it actually creates peace when we allow everybody to flower in their own language, to have Bibles in their own language and culture, to not have to be forced into the same melting pot idea. So in conclusion, I want to say that movements to Christ have flowed along people group lines, even when the people group had a multi-ethnic melting pot culture. While this observation is called the homogeneous unit principle, people groups of high identity aren't necessarily homogeneous. Some people belong to more than one identity group. So they could become a Christian in one identity group or in a different identity group, just as Paul was able to win Greek people to the Lord. He had Roman citizenship. more easily than someone who was like James, completely within the Jewish branch of believing in Christ. Dominant people groups, not those marginalized, are the most interested in having everybody leave their own culture and join their melting pot. But people like to have distinct identity groups to belong to, and these are most stable when they are multi-generational family-based people groups, not ideological or gender-based. So in the West, we like the idea of all the people in our church being from all different backgrounds, and that we're respecting all of them. We'll occasionally sing a song in Spanish or in another language because of people in our church. But really, the people groups that suffer in that kind of a context are the minority people groups. And they mostly have to take on the culture of the dominant people group. So it does not respect them in the way that we think it is. It's respecting them. So by emphasizing the people groups that have no movements to Christ yet, the frontier people groups, we can make sure that no people group is left out of the kingdom, and that the kingdom fully expresses the beauty of each separate culture and language. Movements to Christ bring peace, but they should bring reconciliation and not retribution, harmony without homogeneity, and unity without uniformity. Thank you very much.